Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And as always, it is an honor to be able to stand up and represent the people of Battle River Crowfoot in this place. And I just want to emphasize something very, very significant, Madam Speaker, that my colleague, the member from Bruce Grey, Owen Sound, talked about before. And it was a statement that I think bears repeating because of its significance. It is the fact that MPs should be representing their constituents in Ottawa, not Ottawa to their constituents. And Madam Speaker, it is that attitude to which I endeavor to bring each and every day that I come to this chamber. Now, let me talk just a moment about this chamber, because it bears, I think, emphasis in light of what we're debating here this evening, which is changes to the standing orders, and specifically the amendment that I think is very reasonable brought forward by the opposition House Leader to see a sunset on the changes that the government is, I would dare to say, ramming through this place with little consultation and certainly a great concern that is brought up by many as to what the implications of these things might be. But to speak specifically about this place, Madam Speaker, you know, for more than 8 centuries, there has been a parliamentary process that has evolved and been developing to get us to the point where we are here today. From the fields of Runningmead through the foundations of responsible government, when we took, when there were some pivotal moments, when Robert Baldwin and Louis Lafontaine I believe it was in Montreal, saw about the foundation of what was called responsible government. And Madam Speaker, to the point when we had our first parliamentary elections and the appointment of Sir John A. Macdonald as our first Prime Minister, the times when Canada became a nation, when we saw a burning down of our parliamentary building that saw less disruption, when our parliament buildings literally burnt to the ground in the beginning of the 20th century than we did when the COVID-19 pandemic took place. Madam Speaker, democracy matters. Democracy is worth fighting for, and democracy is something that we need to, each and every one of us, need to be diligent and focused on protecting. And Madam Speaker, when we see the sort of antics and behaviors that we do by this Liberal government that seems to have very little respect for our democratic process, they have very little respect for democracy, very little respect for anybody that doesn't agree with them and their ideas of how the country should be run. Now, Madam Speaker, although Conservatives did actually receive more votes in the last election than the Liberals did, that's something that they like to conveniently forget. And the Liberals specifically said that they would not join a coalition with the NDP, which we found out was categorically untrue after only a number of months after the last election. Madam Speaker, it bears upon all of us the responsibility to defend democracy and to make sure that the long standing traditions in this place are preserved. Now, Madam Speaker, we saw a host of challenges that came about because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And although I didn't think that I'd have to spend my first number of months, my first number of months as a member of Parliament fighting to even be able to do my job, to make sure that I was able to represent my constituents in this place, we eventually got to a point where we could ensure that those voices from coast to coast, from sea to sea to sea in this country, Madam Speaker, were heard. It was something that took time and it took effort, and we did get to a point where hybrid was able to ensure those voices could be heard in the midst of some of those challenging circumstances. But, Madam Speaker, we proved that it was possible, but that doesn't mean that it should be continued in that matter, especially when there are those who would abuse it. And Madam Speaker, I'd like to make a specific point to emphasize that very thing. And that is, in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that the Liberals, instead of ensuring that they brought the country together, what was one of their first proposals? Well, Madam Speaker, it was quite something, because what the Liberals proposed was not pandemic supports. It was not helping Canadians at a time when it was absolutely necessary. No, Madam Speaker. It was they wanted to grant themselves unlimited taxation and spending authority. That was the Liberals' response to a crisis. Never let a good crisis go to waste, they said. And they were going to give themselves unlimited taxation and spending authority without parliamentary approval, spitting in the face of 8 centuries of responsible government. Madam Speaker, it is not without extreme caution that I enter into this debate to say we should be very, very careful in how we approach the seriousness to ensure that we preserve our democratic institutions. And I think, Madam Speaker, specifically to the amendment that's been brought forward, let's make sure that we study this. Let's make sure that we have a sunset on it. Let's make sure that we can carefully evaluate how these dramatic changes to the way that Parliament works, that they can be studied in a fulsome manner to ensure that we can, in fact, do what is best, ultimately for our constituents, ultimately for Canadians. For Madam Speaker, it is only one place in this country, one room in this country, that ensures that every square inch, every person has a voice, and it is this place. Now, Madam Speaker, there is a wide variety of perspectives here. No question. There is a wide variety of personalities, no question. Professions, no question. Political parties, no question. But, Madam Speaker, it is in this place where we are able to accomplish the thing called dialogue and debate, which is so fundamental to the functioning of our democracy. And, Madam Speaker, when it comes to standing up for that, it should be the first and primary responsibility of not only a First Minister, a Prime Minister, not only a government represented through the cabinet, not only members of every political party, every MP here, but it should be so very much the focus of all of those who have the honor of being able to be a temporary tenant of these green seats in Canada's House of Commons. Yes, Madam Speaker, the unfortunate trend is the government prefers obedience as opposed to opposition. And let me use another example. I think that a very significant example actually has to do with the coalition partners over there at the far end of the House, the Fourth Party. Guaranteed. You see, it's interesting because the NDP, they are much of an opposition party. And this is a great example of this, the debate we're having here. I don't think that there's actually a lot of support from members of the NDP for this sort of thing, because it actually goes contrary to the ideals that they purport to have that go beyond their parliamentary functions in the context of this so-called confidence and supply arrangement. So, Madam Speaker, I think that this is more about either incompetence or laziness, and sometimes it's difficult to tell between the two which it is, because it is when when a fourth party gives a blank check to a government that was elected as a minority, it is unacceptable that they would do so with so little recognition for the impact that has on how our country operates. And, Madam Speaker, you know, I don't know if it is the leader of the NDP is more focused on video games than he is worried about the interests of his party, but I know I speak to a number, and it may surprise some members of the NDP. There are a few of them in my constituency. Only a few, but there are a few members of the NDP. I've heard from a surprising number of them over the last number of months in the last year or so, where there's these what I...
Oh, I'm so sorry. The honourable member's time is like up. I'm so sorry.
The honourable member for Battle River, Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And in my previous 8 minutes that I spoke about yesterday, I unpacked some of both the challenges with what the Liberals are proposing and why I believe that the sunset, what is more or less a sunset clause that the opposition House Leader has proposed, is so vitally important to the discussion that we have. But, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to conclude my remarks on this by emphasizing something that I believe is resulting in a profound, or is causing a erosion of our democratic institutions in this country. Mr. Speaker, we see a growing disconnect between the executive branch of government in Canada and the legislative branch of government in Canada. And the reason why I bring this up is because it is foundational to what makes Canada distinct as a Westminster federal state. We have, unlike our American counterparts in the United States, unlike other republics around the world, we see that our executive branch of government, represented by the Prime Minister, the First Minister among what is supposed to be equals, although that tradition, I think, has long since gone away, and the government represented by the Cabinet in the front bench, members of the Privy Council, we have seen a growing disconnect between what happens in this place and what conduct they decide upon when it comes to how government operates. And Mr. Speaker, this is especially concerning because in our nation, it is this place, with the exception of senators that are elected from Alberta, being the small exception, this is the only institution on a national level where Canadians get to choose who represents them. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion to my speech, I would urge all members of this House, and specifically Liberal members, who seem to be intent on seeing that growth, that disconnect expands between the executive and legislative branches of government, because, Mr. Speaker, the ultimate result is that breaks the very foundation of what our democracy is supposed to be. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the Honourable Minister of Families.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his speech. I did want to note that there are, in fact, 2 members of his caucus who have had babies during this Parliament, who have actually been able to participate fully as members of Parliament after giving birth because of the hybrid option that is available. And so, since he and his party is opposed to this, I'd like to understand how they propose that his colleagues could participate following giving birth to their children in such a way. And I'd also like to ask him, and I hope he answers honestly, if he or any other member of his caucus has ever availed themselves of the voting app or of using the hybrid system, and why he feels that we should not continue to do this, because it's actually enabling more gender equity in this place and allowing a greater diversity of people to participate and represent their constituents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I find it very interesting that a Minister of the Crown wouldn't have commented on my most recent remarks about the growing disconnect between the legislative and executive branches of government, because, Mr. Speaker, I think that highlights the troubling trend that we're seeing that is causing an erosion of trust within this institution, and that is contributing to why Canadians simply not only do not trust the Liberals, but simply are losing trust in the institutions, the democratic institutions of our country. And they point to members like that minister and the Prime Minister, among others, who are directly contributing to that. Mr. Speaker, my commute each week is about 12 hours doorstep to doorstep. And I count it an honor and a responsibility in the midst of the family sacrifice associated with this. Never once have Conservatives said that we shouldn't find accommodation. It's playing politics on what we believe are serious issues when it comes to the need to ensure that we respect our democratic institutions and the more than 8 centuries of history associated with that. So, Mr. Speaker, I would urge that minister and members of all the other political parties that seem to be bent on rushing into these things, let's take a pause and ensure that we are finding the right balance, because simply put, my constituents do not trust members like that and other Liberals who seem to be putting their political self-interest ahead of that of the country and our democratic institution, including those who would be pushing for inclusion, greater inclusion.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the Honourable Member Esquimalt-Saanich-Sooke.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say, as one of the people who believes very much in diversity in the House of Commons and making sure that all kinds of Canadians can actually participate in democracy, I'm a strong supporter of the virtual Parliament measures. And I think it is essential to our democracy that Parliament does evolve and does change. And next door to me, the member for Victoria is a young mom who's about 2 days away from having a second child. And because she can't fly, during that period, she would be excluded from these proceedings if it weren't for virtual Parliament. And so I think that what we're seeing here is an evolution that makes Parliament more democratic and more representative. And I find it hard to see. I like the member, have a long commute, and I go home every weekend, and I don't avail myself of virtual Parliament very often. But that doesn't mean I think others should be deprived of that right.
Honourable Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, with the answer or the question that was just asked, along with the comments associated with it, and likewise the minister who asked before, then I expect that they will be supporting the amendment put forward by the House Leader. Because what that does, pure and simple, Mr. Speaker, is ensure that Parliament continues to be able to look at this and its impacts on our ability to do our work in this place, Mr. Speaker. Never once have Conservatives said that we shouldn't endeavour to increase inclusion, that there should not be accommodations made. To suggest that is blatantly untrue. So, Mr. Speaker, what we need to do, however, is ensure that we maintain and treat carefully, with the utmost respect, the democratic infrastructure that we have, this place, this House of Commons, however one participates in it, treat it with the utmost respect to ensure that we are ultimately respecting Canadians, Mr. Speaker. That needs to be our focus. That needs to be our emphasis. It needs to be focused on ensuring that Canadians can be represented in this place.